Welcome to the Divine Gossip Podcast. I'm your host, Mackenzie Foster, a professional psychic medium, tarot reader, and spiritual mentor, here to provide you with the next steps towards your dream reality, along with clarity and deep validation while on your spiritual journey. I have an immense passion for all things paranormal, spiritual, and of course, having some super fun chats with incredibly knowledgeable people. In each episode, we will expand our minds, ignite our inner psychics, embrace our spiritual awakening journeys, and live a super grounded, witchy life. I hope you learned something new in today's episode. Hello, and welcome back to Divine Gossip. I have another amazing guest on, as always. My dear tarot reader friend, Haley. Haley, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do, how you got here, and all that jazz.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I am predominantly a professional tarot reader and a spiritualist. So of course, that means I sink a lot of my time into, studies geared toward understanding energy and human experience. I'm also a writer. I've got my first book coming out soon, so I'm hesitant to use that word, but we'll get there. I do like to consider myself somewhat of an artist. I think a lot of this life is meant for tinkering and experimenting with different things. So I feel like I'm multifaceted that way. I do have a relatively technical background though. So I've spent a good chunk of my career in technical engineering settings, believe it or not. Basically assembling teams for Apple was what I was doing before. And I think that's a good way to represent the dichotomy of my life's work in general. It's a handful of technical, a handful of some of the less obvious components of life, and I marry them together into one beautiful little experience.
Oh my God, you're such a free spirit and so inspirational and very intelligent. I was just telling Haley before we started recording that the last tarot reading she gave me played out perfectly. Unfortunately, but very good for you because you're very psychic. But you're very good at what you do, and I'm very happy that you leaned into your communication skills and your intelligence, especially around spirituality, because you're just very good at it. So
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was saying it to you before, but it's a good thing to be right, but it's a bad thing to be right sometimes too, when things don't pan out the way we want. But yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot. I think I've landed in a good little niche for me.
yeah, for sure. For sure. And you travel a lot, right? When's
Oh,
the last place you went?
let me see. I spent a couple weeks backpacking in Costa Rica, but I'm about to go to Guatemala actually with a woman that I met in the rainforest in Costa Rica, which is just from a novel. I feel like I've been so excited. But yeah, I think that's is an interesting point to bring up too, because I find that travel often enhances my understanding of the world. And I think that's what we're trying to do a lot of times with belief or spirituality, with our life's work, whichever way you want to frame that, is aiming to understand and explore and find out new information. And especially travel, I think, enhances my understanding of other people's belief system as well, which inherently gives an opportunity for me to audit mine at the same time. It's an evolutionary process, it never ends. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think traveling is so fucking important, especially if you live in America, because you're so sheltered. I grew up thinking that Africa was poverty, disgusting, like such a isolated place with starving people everywhere when Africa is fucking beautiful. And I'm saying Africa because I'm in school as well. So I am in like world cultures and literatures, and I'm just now learning that like the curriculum that I grew up on actually isn't accurate, and there's a lot of beauty in places that I thought was just poverty. So anyway, traveling is a must in my opinion, if you are able, because it gives you the perspective, and not the danger of a single perspective.
That's a really good point. And it is tricky in the United States, I think, for us to leave the continent. It's very expensive to leave the
Yes.
continent. Not only that, but the US is huge. I mean, to get somewhere, sometimes it takes a lot. And because it's not really built into our culture to travel, like you mentioned, growing up, you've got a very limited vision in terms of what the rest of the world is. And so I think that's, yeah, you're totally right. That's why it's important to challenge that, because
Yes.
there are a lot of places I've been where people will tell me before I go, they're like, oh, it's not safe. Don't go, don't go. You know, you go and it's safer than anywhere I've ever been in the United States. So
Right.
it's so relative, you know, but
Exactly. What is your stance on spirituality and religion now? Like, what do you believe in? What are your values? What do you lean on your journey?
yeah, you know, I think there is a bit of validity and meaning that we could pull out of just about every belief system. And that's something that I have become increasingly convinced of the more that I speak to people and the more that I, of course, travel and, you know, am having these conversations. And for me, it's really important to study different belief systems, not only through text and reading, you know, their sacred novels and stuff like this, but also like speaking to people who participate in the culture of religion, because religion and spirituality and belief can be different than the culture around those beliefs, right? So
Mm.
everything is tainted a little bit by the way that we interact with it as people. And so I think there's a little bit of meaning in every belief system. I don't personally subscribe to any one organized religion. I do think that we choose religion and spirituality based on what we're needing on a personal level and also a societal level. And I think that's something that kind of can be examined. The most reachable example I could give you is, let's take the transition from the deities and the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece to, you know, a more modern Christianity. A lot of times when we look at that from a sociological perspective, we can understand the shifts that the society was going through in terms of history. So we take a religion from having a lot of different deities, a lot of different gods that people could kind of select who they were going to relate to in a way, right? To something that was more focused, you know, like Catholic Christianity, where there's still saints, there's still individual stories to identify with, but there's one central deity who is known and, you know, is self-proclaimed as a jealous God. You know, you shall not have no other God before me. And I think a lot of that is representative of what people were looking for in their leadership and looking for in their beliefs at the time. And so that's why I say, you know, in a way, I think every belief system has some validity and has some meaning. I find that what we choose is more indicative of what we're needing on a personal level. So let's say, you know, if you lean toward Christianity, which I don't, but it's very popular in the West, so I think it's a reachable example. You know, you might be needing a little bit more structure. Maybe you like a little bit more authority. You want to feel like the deity that you're worshiping is somewhat of a parentified role, right? Whereas the people in ancient Greece, more so, if you look at their gods and their goddesses, they were exaggerated traits that human beings already have. You know, their gods were more vengeful, they were more jealous, they were more violent than us, but they also had opposite traits, you know, like positive traits that were much greater than what we could ever hope to achieve. So, point being, I don't subscribe to any one organized religion, but I do believe in somewhat of a merger between science and spirituality. So what I always cite is the scientific law of conservation of energy, which basically states that energy can't be created and it can't be destroyed. And I believe in that. I believe in, you know, transmutation of energy. I believe that we're all inherently a bit connected. I don't think we just disappear when we, you know, enter our lives here earthside. Um, but that is what I think I can conclusively say. You know, I think everybody's got a point where they're coming from. Nobody knows for sure, of course. But that's kind of how I define my own walk with spirituality, is based on what I've studied in other people, what I find to be relevant and what I find to be kind, and also what I've observed.
Yeah, yeah. Beautiful explanation. You're so smart. Um, I have a question. Have you ever seen the movie Avatar?
No, I haven't.
The fuck? You need to watch it.
No, I know. I'm not a big
Watch
movie.
it. It's basically they have like the avatar species. I'm a fucking avatar nerd, and this is the first time I'm saying this publicly, so welcome to my authenticity. I'm trying to share more personal stuff, but I love Avatar. I love first movie and the second movie. There's two movies, and the species has of avatars, like the giant blue people, have one deity that they worship or work with, and it's Awa, which is their earth, their planet, and it's like an interconnectedness intelligence within the planet. Anyway, if you did watch it, I would have questions about your opinions, but I want you to watch it. That's your homework assignment.
Okay, okay, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, please do. Anyway, it reminded me of that. I don't know. But do you if you're comfortable sharing, do you work with goddesses, right? Or
Yeah,
and
yeah.
or who do you work with?
Yeah, so I work with Aphrodite and I work with Hecate predominantly. Uh,
Damn.
I know. I love them for different reasons. And I think that my philosophy on it is that they're deities that I find to be identifiable, right? Like obviously there's a reason that we work with the deities we do. I have not whittled down whether I believe in their presence in terms of like an actual overseeing God versus their presence in metaphor. With Aphrodite, I think one of the really great things that I've learned from working with her and reading about her and through her energies um, are that, you can find beauty in rest. And I think that was something that I was really needing to move toward. I mean, still, right? But more chronically so, I would say in the past of my life, is allowing that space for rest. Because one of the things that I think is really misunderstood about her is I think people imagine Aphrodite and they imagine like, oh, she's beautiful and she's a seductress, and which is great. You can be all of those things. But inside there, I think there's a whisper of a message where a lot of times the only opportunity we have to rest is through like beauty routines, as silly as that sounds. But if you go and you get a facial, you go and you get your nails done, for a lot of us that's the only time in your week that you're really being able to take the opportunity to rest. And so understanding that beauty is not something that's just vain but can be restorative, I think was a really big theme for me. And there are truths in different ways about Hecate as well that I resonate with. So yes, I would say that I work with those energies, but I don't think I can say with confidence, do I believe this is an actual deity versus this is the energy that I feel like I'm working with? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes giving things a name can be helpful. Um, but I never want to be extremely declarative about what I believe, because if I've learned anything through my life, it's that it changes a lot. And I think as long as you're moving through your life and you're being intentional to be kind to other people and you're minding your impact, that's kind of where the thesis of my journey lies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to stay fluid, but still like stay firm in your values, obviously. But I mean, I think I definitely lean more towards gods and goddesses being more of an energy to tap into, like an energetic stream. And then that energy can manifest into a being. Like, because I feel like in meditation, I can talk to Aphrodite and Hecate if I want, but it's not like they're a person in the sky like God is proclaimed to be in Christianity, So that's kind of what I think. And I love what you said about Aphrodite. That is so true. Like, because I've been, and I think I'm not going to say most women, but a lot of women are more, it's more difficult for them to lean into their feminine energy, which, oh, look at that. We're talking about that today. I actually forgot like for a second. But anyway, I like having Aphrodite in my life because she reminds me that it's okay to slow down. It's okay to be in the feminine flow for real. Cause I agree with you so hard. And I was just talking with my mentor about this yesterday is I don't know if you're into astrology, are you?
A little bit, I dabble, yeah.
Okay. So I have a south node. My south node is in Scorpio. My north node is in Taurus.
Mhm.
And so what that basically means for listeners is your south node is kind of what the area in life that you're comfortable in. And it's kind of like what you came into this life being a quote unquote master at. So Scorpio is that death and rebirth energy, that like taboo stuff, which is so obvious for me because I'm a medium. Like it's so natural for me. And that's why working with Hecate is so nice because she's said sometimes to be like the goddess of necromancy and like the dead. And but then my north node being in Taurus, which is kind of where I should be moving towards. Taurus is like the Venus energy, like the Aphrodite energy. So when I had that reading with my mentor yesterday, I was like, no shit, I work with the two goddesses that I need to like be having balance of. So
Oh, it's so funny how that works, isn't it? Actually, you know what? My South Node is also in Scorpio. So it's so funny you say that. But yeah, no, that dichotomy I feel like is so, I keep using that word lately, but I just feel like it's exactly what I mean, is so important. Because and it's so funny, we happen to work with the same energies, that death and rebirth versus like the restorative rest, and even sometimes handling feelings of like envy and jealousy, those extremes that Aphrodite represents, is so important. And I wanted to mention too, there was something really interesting that you said at the beginning of that, where you mentioned basically that you believe in, the gods and goddesses in terms of streams of energy you can tap into. And I wanted to add on to that. I think there's a lot of power behind cumulative belief as well. I think there's something very sacred about studying gods and goddesses and principles that people have flocked to for thousands on thousands of years. There's something about that experience that feels communal, even when your practice is solitary. And so I think that just adds to the power of it. But that's so interesting that there are such opposites that kind of fit together, because I think, if you had been speaking to somebody who maybe didn't know anything about this at all, and you were like, oh yeah, I work with Hecate and Aphrodite, they might be like, okay, whoa, like those are really different, really different energies to be tapping into. But that's so cool.
Yeah. I like what you said. There's such power in community, and I just made a post about this on Instagram, like just honoring the ancient traditions that come with spiritual practices. Like that history is what makes it what it is today, and honoring that is so fucking powerful. It's insane.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's some part of me sometimes, especially when I go ahead and I complete rituals or meditations that I know people have done for thousands of years, where I'm like, okay, I'm a person, like I'm connected to something. And yeah, that is so important.
Yeah, it's beautiful. All right, so we're going to be talking about masculine and feminine energy today, which is perfect segue from Aphrodite and Hecate. It's not that Hecate is masculine, but just maybe dark feminine. But anyway, different energies. Can you explain your perspective on masculine and feminine energy and like how it can show up in humans?
Yeah, of course. So, in the way that I look at this, masculine and feminine, those terms, in some ways, I think in New Age spirituality can be used as a bit of a hangover from the more rigid ideas of traditionalism of the past. And so I think it's really important to make the distinction that when we're talking about masculine and feminine, we're not necessarily talking about male and female. And I think a lot of people get lost in that, because I'm a big history nerd, if you couldn't tell, especially when I'm studying, belief and understandings. And so I want to be cognizant about how I use those terms, because a lot of times masculine and feminine has been used in order to justify oppression or not treating people equally because of perceived certain, unchangeable characteristics. And they are very binary terms, of course, but I think despite the verbiage, what we actually mean to talk about with masculine and feminine has very little to do with gender. I really love this. I used to study psychology, and Carl Jung played around with this concept. There are some problematic things about Carl Jung, so I'm not going to pull on him in entirety, but he kind of played around with this concept. And he talked about anima and animus, which are basically, anima is the feminine aspect that all men have, whereas animus is the masculine aspect that all women have. And so I say that to mention that this is not a new idea, right? That both men and women, non-binary people, everything in between, contain both feminine and masculine energy. And I just kind of wanted to mention that right off the bat, because I think because of the words that are used, those things can get entangled, male and female and masculine and feminine. But I think in its purest form, feminine energy is usually used to represent receptive energy or receptive understanding. And you see this a lot in symbols with spirituality and the tarot, so on and so forth. Whereas masculine, I think, is often used to talk about production, right? So feminine, we could assume, is receptive and creation, whereas masculine is about production. Creation and production both elicit something, but in very different ways, right? So we have the active feminine and passive feminine. And we have active masculine and passive masculine. And I think we don't talk about that divide. We tend to look at it as just these two pillars, and they're not. So, if we look at active femininity, if you think about like the Empress card in the tarot, that's active femininity. It's the act of creating and nurturing. Really what it represents is mankind's ability to create beyond need and the urge to imagine beyond necessity. Whereas if we look at an active masculine energy, we could say like the Emperor, right? What we're talking about there is laying down structure, laying down order. Perhaps we could even include, production into that. Yeah. And so when we look at passive feminine energy, we could lean more into the energy of, let's say, like the high priestess, where there's a lot of intuitive understanding, there's a lot of learning that's going on through that perception. And I think that's something we forget to mention about the passive feminine as well, because of the gender roles that have been played in the past. The passive feminine is inherently somebody who seeks out knowledge. Sometimes we can find passive energy even in passive feminine energy in the scholar, because this is about receiving, understanding, and really synthesizing that information and creating meaning out of it in eventuality. Whereas passive masculine is almost never talked about, almost never. And for that, we can pull on, I'm pulling on the tarot a lot here because I think it's easy to understand, at least from my perspective, right? If you've got a background in tarot. But the passive masculine is like the Hierophant or the Hermit or the Hanged Man, where there is a lot of receptivity going on, but in a slightly different way than we see with the passive feminine of the High Priestess. The Hierophant, for example, when we talk about passive masculine, is somebody who is receiving the understanding of traditionalism of the past in order to basically hold that down in the present. So it's not about creating and I'm going to pave this and I'm going to set up this structure. This is receiving the structure that's already there and holding it. So that's the way that I tend to look at those differences. And the way that I feel like it shows up in people is completely different per person. And I think we all have a blend of those, to keep it simple, those 4 branches of feminine versus masculine, active versus passive. It just kind of depends on who we are and what our walk with life is.
Yeah, yeah, I 1000% agree. I've actually never thought about putting it in those terms like passive and active, but it makes so much sense because you're so right. Like the passive masculine is never talked about because I've never heard those terms, but it makes so much sense. And I've never thought about the Hierophant. Isn't the Hierophant in tarot Taurus
Mhm.
energy? It's interesting that the Empress is Taurus too. Isn't that
The
weird?
the Empress, I believe, is associated with Libra.
Is it?
I believe so, yeah.
Oh shit. Well, I've been doing that wrong.
But
Well, whatever. I always just think about the Empress as like that Venus in energy a little bit, so I just associate it with Taurus in my head. But anyway, I love everything you just said. I have actually nothing to add. That was perfect. um
oh, I know. I think a lot of times we don't distinguish between those two because, and that's the tricky thing with it being so binary, right? And that's why I'm like, I kind of resist the term masculine and feminine, just because you can have active feminine energy and be, absolutely creating, and I think we look at anything that's bringing something into fruition as masculine, which is interesting because
yeah,
if we take it way, way back to the basics, femininity is associated with creation, like Mother Earth, but also, women,
yeah.
for the most part, are people who like birth life into existence. And so I think we tend to negate that part of it just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how do you think these energies manifest differently in people? Like, regardless of gender, obviously, like we've established, because masculine and feminine energy do not mean woman and female. I mean, male and female.
Oh, I get you. I think human beings were really adaptive creatures. And so we tend to produce whatever it is that we didn't have or haven't had historically growing up or, in young adulthood. The journey continues on. But what I find is that in an ideal world, we would have a balance of these energies. And I think it heavily is contingent upon who you're interacting with as well, because um, let's say, this could go from anywhere from coworkers to friends to significant others. We need to have a balance in the way that we're working with other people. There's a reason that, if you've got a group of 3 people, not everybody can be the leader because the wheels are going to fall off the tricycle. You know what I mean? Um, but this is interesting because going back to that bit that I mentioned about Carl Jung kind of pulling up this idea of, hey, like we maybe all have this inside of us. He actually believed that the cause of a lot of mental distress or even like physical ailments was due to an imbalance. And he thought everybody should have an ability to find this balance in theory, right? And so when you're saying, how does this, manifest differently in different people, I think it heavily it depends on our walks with life. So like I said, we're adaptive creatures. We're trying to produce whatever it is that we didn't have because we're trying to compensate. And in theory, we're all trying to move forward and create a better life than what we had before, in theory. And so I guess a lot of the ways that I see it is, let's say when you grew up, there was nobody there to listen to you. So now maybe you're the therapist of your friend group. Maybe you lend a listening ear to people when you know they need it. That's you tapping into your passive feminine energy. It's intuitive, it's writing things down, it's seeking answers, it's seeking understanding through observing other people, maybe inside of the self as well.
I have a
Um,
question. Do you
yeah.
think do you think that passive feminine can also be like negative traits like people pleasing?
Oh, of course. Of course. I think any of these traits can be positive or negative based on
Okay.
how you use it, for
Yeah.
sure. Because of course it's not always good to be the therapist friend. It's not always good to be, the intuitive one if you're perceiving so much that it's making you feel overwhelmed and overridden. So that's the tricky thing about it, is it depends on, are we approaching this in a way that's positive or negative? And I was actually chewing on that the other day with the emperor, because the emperor, a lot of times we put the emperor in the place of a paternal figure or someone who's upholding structure and order and is very authoritative. And in a healthy position, that is active masculine energy, right? And in a healthy position, it's force that is positive. And that's a tricky thing to chew on. And I think, especially, not to generalize, but a lot of the women that I talk to, we struggle with this energy because it can certainly be turned very negative. Having a presence that is authoritative and commanding and is implying the order can be awful. But on the other side of things, if it's used in a healthy manner, and I love this metaphor, it's like if you're in a pottery studio, right? There's a certain sense of force that's positive and decisiveness that is positive that has to happen when you're choosing how to shape that clay. You need positive force involved in that process. So, yes, of course, everything can be positive and negative with the active and passive, with the masculine and feminine, depending on the way that you treat it. So, going back to your a point of origin here with the passive femininity, where you're like, could that be negative? Of course, of course you could be, hyperextending yourself for other people, or not getting a word at the table, or, and that's why in a perfect world, you would have a balance of all these energies. You could pull that passive feminine out of your pocket when you need to be an empathetic friend, when somebody's going through hardship. But you could also, pull out that active feminine and, be able to create in your own life and step away when you need to. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit of balance of everything, I think.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Have you ever, I don't, I think I've asked you this before probably, but have you ever thought about teaching a tarot class, which I'm sure you also get asked this a million times?
Yes, I think about it all the time because I'm a real nerd.
Yeah.
Whatever I'm into, I'm going to follow that rabbit hole to the absolute bottom of the earth.
Yes.
Um, I think I will, but I'm a bit in a stage of life the last couple years where I want to be receptive. I want to receive. I want to understand, and I'm not quite ready to give it that creation edge yet. I have, though, thought pretty intensely about hosting some sort of travel or retreat and giving a very condensed course over the series of like a week or two, because I think that would be a really beautiful merger. I love to connect with people. I love to have conversation. I don't find quite as much gratification in creating structure. I'm a little bit more in that creation energy than production energy, I guess. And I could use a blend of the two. Don't get me wrong. In eventuality, I think yes, but I'm getting there. I've got a lot of projects on the docket.
Okay, cool. I'm like, I feel like I've been reading tarot for a long time, but I just learn every time you talk about tarot, I learn so much. So, um, okay. So in okay. Can you, oh, speaking of reading, can you share examples in your readings where masculine and feminine energies have interacted or influenced each other? Which this is going to be good for people who are maybe learning tarot, especially because I know you use tarot in all your readings, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, gosh, I feel like I could pull on a million examples. I
Yeah.
find a lot of times when I'm reading for people, um, the easiest way to explain it is like this. Sometimes I will have an energy come forward that does not match the gender of my sitter. And I think people struggle with that a little bit. If I've got, for For example, if I've got a gentleman sitting in front of me and I'm pulling the Empress and I'm talking to him about what that energy is, I think there is inherently a knee-jerk reaction of resistance. And the more that I explain to them, I'm like, okay, it's not about male and female, it's not about gender. And I think that helps loosen people up a little, because we get very defensive over our perceived roles and what we feel like we're supposed to be. And when it comes to readings, I often notice that a lot of issues inside of my clients' interpersonal relationships have to do with, and this is an overused term, right? But have to do with the balance of the situation. You know, everything in this life is not going to be perfectly symmetric. Even if you've got the healthiest relationship in the whole world, it's not like you're going to wash 3 dishes and then your partner is going to wash 3 dishes. That's not how it works. We all have different roles we settle into, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality, because that is how we work together. You know, we decide, this is my role, this is your role. And the cool thing about where we are right now in the timeline is we get to decide those things. It's no longer, at least, you know, where we're living in the West, it's no longer, you know, women have to stay home and men have to go to work. We can have any assembly of that balance that we choose, which in some ways, when we remove the scripts, can make it just a path that we have to forge on our own, which can feel foreign. And so in my readings with clients, what I often notice is that there is somewhat of a misalignment in our relationships, where we are clung to a role that our partner does not actually require us to play. So an easy example, just to give this a little bit of tangibility, is I have had a lot of clients who are men who have kind of like a provider complex going on, where they feel like in order to be loved, in order to be worthy of their partner's affection, validation, however you want to put it, they need to be making a ton of money. They need to be making a ton of money. They need to be perceived as very strong. You know, maybe they can fix things around the house. And a lot of cases, that's not actually what their partner is looking for in them. And so that's just one example of masculine energy. Think like Emperor in the reverse, right? Masculine energy that's a bit in overdrive in a way that's not helpful for the person who's experiencing it, and also not helpful for their partner or their coworker or their friend, whoever it is we're interacting with, right? And it's difficult because it's very hard to find that balance inside of ourselves. So to bring it to a personal example, when I was probably all the way up until my early 20s, I had a real provider complex. That was something that my family struggled with growing up. You know, there was a sense of, are we going to make it to the next paycheck kind of a thing? And so I went super, super hyperactive into my active masculine role. I was working 4 jobs, I was in school full time, and I found a lot of my identity there. And I think that's the tricky thing about masculine and feminine, active and passive, is sometimes we cling on to these roles as though they're definitive of who we are as a human being or who we are as a spiritual being, which is where things can fall out of propulsion and become dangerous for us. Because if your identity is tied to something like a job, or, you know, active masculine energy, let's say, and that component of your life is removed, job loss, a pandemic hits, in my case, our identity starts to crumble. So not only is it important to sustain that balance inside of ourselves, but also inside of our relationships. And that's why I think you can be totally good on your own. You're going through a period of singlehood and you're like, yeah, this is awesome. I'm healed. I'm doing great. And you get into a relationship and you realize, oh my God, I have not healed this shit like I thought I did, because there's a rebalancing that has to happen. So I would say that this balance of masculine and feminine takes place in every single reading that I do, whether that's on an individual level, in relationships, in career, because we're all kind of trying to tweak what's going on to come a little bit closer to center so we're not falling off of that balance beam.
Yeah. The relationship example you gave was very relatable. So Cody, my boyfriend, who we now live together, so we're experiencing that new balance that needs to happen. And he got in that provider energy in a very toxic way. He was like, I got this, we're good, I got it all on my shoulders, because I'm like in school and growing a business, so it's very like I just am learning and growing, and I am providing obviously, but he's providing the most right now, right? So he took a lot on his shoulders, and he ended up getting so in that he would just identify with that only, and then he would come home and like shut down, because and then we had to have a conversation. Literally 2 days ago we had the conversation. I was like, you're not nurturing, you're not showing any emotion, you're not like, you're so in your masculine that it's like it's affecting our relationship now. And he was like, and then he finally admitted like, I've just been so stressed with work, and like I feel like I just need to provide for you and Louis, which is my fucking cat. Like he's such a sweet guy. And so we literally had that conversation because it can get toxic, you know. And um anyway, and I'm guessing you went through the personal example of being so hyper masculine and then, you know, going into that more feminine energy and relaxing finally, and being able to receive instead of go go go, you know. That's exactly what I am learning. Like one of my affirmations right now in my morning meditations is I am not what I do. Like I am more than what I do. I am more than my business. I am more than the money I bring in, you know. So
And that's a really hard recognition to have. And I think that's such a great example that you gave too, where with your partner, from his perspective, he was probably like, hey, I'm trying to give you everything that you need. I'm trying to be good for you. And I think a lot of times we have that inside of us. We're like, I'm trying to be good for you, whether that's in the feminine or the masculine or active path, whatever. And it's so interesting because there is a lot of like societal influence as well, right? Like we do have not as many social scripts as we used to maybe in like the 60s, but there still are those social scripts, right? Where as a man, he feels this pressure to be like, okay, now I've got to provide because I've got this, beautiful girlfriend at home that I have to take care of, and, our cat and our family and everything. Whereas what you were needing from him was actually quite the opposite. You were like, hey, I don't actually want this from you. And I'm appreciative of it, I'm sure, but what I'm looking for is the other edge to you. And that was something, yeah, that I absolutely experienced on a couple different occasions. On my own personal accord, I kind of mentioned I was working 4 jobs, I was doing all this crazy stuff, and then the pandemic hit. And it was, I think, for a lot of us, a forced stop. It was like, okay, who are you when there is nobody else around you? Where is your identity?
yes. Yeah.
And I think that's why a lot of us went through, so-called awakenings or even like recognition. There's a joke online, of course, about like everybody realized their sexuality during the pandemic because you had to sit alone with yourself in a room and be like, man, who am I? And so to add on to that, I feel like I've had a bit of an interesting journey, not only from like a work perspective of the active masculine turning more into my active feminine, a lot of creativity around that time, a lot of art, but also I noticed when I started only dating women, I had a much different reaction in terms of blend of masculine and feminine energy. And I think this is something that a lot of queer people struggle with at first because, speaking about how now we don't have the same social scripts we did in the 60s. For queer couples, there are no social scripts. There's nobody's to say who asks who out, who opens the door, who pays for, like, you get to design and decide all those things on your own. And I think it's been a really sacred experience for me because I feel like I've gotten to find an authentic version of myself, not just in my dating life, but in my internal world, right? Like, what do I want to do? What do I want to be the one that predominantly provides? Not that there has to be one, but do I want to be the one that predominantly provides? Do I want to be, the one that is taking on more of the household labor? Should it be an even blend? How do we decide that? And so ironically, I feel like when I was, and this is a personal thing, of course, not to say that it's universal, but ironically, I found that when I was dating men, I was more in my active masculine energy. And I feel like now I'm a little bit more in my active feminine energy because I've stopped resisting femininity so much. And I think that's something that a lot of girls and women go through, regardless of, identity or dating or whatever, is that in a world, in a society, I guess I should say in the West, that really values masculine traits, productivity, especially, we're in late stage capitalism here, productivity, working a lot, we've got a heavy work culture here in the States. And sometimes it can be hard to feel like our femininity has value and it's looked at as like soft and weak and things that we don't want to be associated with.
Yeah.
And so finding space as women to drop into that energy, or as people in general to drop into that energy, is important. And it's in different ways harder to bring it back to that example of your partner. It's hard as well in different ways for men to be able to drop into that as well. And so I think roles can give us understanding of, I guess it gives us more of a template, I should say, than understanding. It gives us a template of where to go, but ultimately we're all still human beings walking around and living life and trying to figure out how to do and be the right thing. And so in general, I think it's hard for all of us just through different little nuances.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you had the space and like the ability to explore that and to drop into that femininity. And I'm just now able to do that now. I feel like having a boyfriend who is very self-aware and open and honest and able to shift energy when he needs to has been able I've been able to relax, you know. um so yeah, absolutely. I don't think I wrote this in our little outline here, but I also want to just mention masculine and feminine energy, as we've said, is not gender, but the physical traits that society deems as masculine and feminine. What are your thoughts on that? I feel like we should touch on that because a lot of this is just societal conditioning, you know?
Yeah. When you say physical traits, can you elaborate on what you mean by that a little bit? I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, like obviously we know that masculine and feminine energy is energy. It's not physical traits, it's not gender. But when someone is like for example, I'm watching I don't know if you watch reality TV, but I'm watching Vanderpump Rules, and Tom, one of the Toms in the show, paints his nails, and his friends were making fun of him because he's acting more feminine than usual, and I'm like, okay, fuck off, like guys can paint their nails too. So what is your opinion on just like it do you agree? I mean, obviously I know you do, but any thoughts on why society has deemed certain physical traits or hobbies as feminine and masculine when we're just talking about energy at the end of the day?
I think we really instinctively like to categorize things because it makes us feel like we understand what's going on. And I think that is kind of what we see in terms of resistance a lot. That example of, a guy painting his nails or whatever. I, well, I guess maybe let me turn it a little bit more into like hobbies and activities. We tend to look at, I don't know, like football, right? Like watching football is a masculine thing, whereas, maybe painting is a more feminine thing, or painting our nails, or, whatever. I think we try to create these boxes to almost assign and prescribe what should go where. And to be honest with you, I feel like this would take such an intense deep dive into history and religion and cultures, and it's different everywhere in the world. But one thing I think that I've been chewing on the last couple of years that I've learned to appreciate about femininity through the lens of this question is that I think femininity is allowed to be a little bit more expressive in terms of the way we physically arrange ourselves. Maybe not in terms of like beauty standards and things like that, but painting your nails, dyeing your hair, putting on makeup, putting on different shapes of outfits. Whereas I feel like what we deem to be conventionally masculine in appearance is a little bit more cut and dry. And it makes me feel so bummed that it's that way, because how fun would it be if nobody felt the limitations of whether or not they could express themselves? I had a conversation with my dad a couple years ago, and it stuck with me because I was like, man, but he was saying to me when I first came out, he was like, and he meant this in the most dad way he could mean it, but he was like, I really, sometimes I'm envious of men in the queer community because they can do such fun things. He was like, they can wear eyeliner and, have the cool jackets and paint their nails and stuff like that. And he was like, if I did that, there's no way anybody around me would accept me, but I would have so much fun doing that. And it just broke
Oh
my
my
whole heart because
God.
I know, because I was like, man, like as human beings, I feel like a lot of life is play. A lot of life is, playing with different colors and textures. And if we just take it down to the raw human experience, aside from all of the learning and growth and lessons, we're here to experience, in my opinion. And so I feel like I couldn't give a totally comprehensive and educated answer on why I think that we've whittled it down that way, other than that masculinity is so deeply associated with structure and rigidity and upholding a certain type of like concrete presence. Whereas femininity seems to be a little bit more able to ebb and flow. Again, that's a totally different conversation than beauty standards, and that's a whole other deep dive. But yeah, I wish that it was a little bit more blended that way, because that broke my heart. I was like, man, I wonder, and this is like, a 50-year-old guy, my dad sitting there and saying this to me. I'm like, I wonder how many other men have dabbled with that thought, but haven't had the courage to ever express it to anybody. Um, but yeah, no, I feel like we're seeing a little bit more of that now, which is good. I feel like I see, and maybe I'm just living in a big city now, right? But I feel like I'm seeing a little bit more of, men being able to paint their nails or wear the eyeliner. And I hope that that is on an uptick as time moves forward, just so that everybody feels like they can be authentic, because that's a difficult thing to be.
Yeah. I just feel like we should touch on that because a lot of it is just expectations, and sometimes it doesn't have to be that fucking serious. So
Yeah.
just
No.
express yourself, if you are safe to do so. So I have two more questions. So when we think about like the spiritual community and the spiritual world, I don't have a lot of opinions on how masculine and feminine energies, like those terms, are used in the spiritual space. Because in my world that I live in, and the people I interact with, and the clients I see, and the way I talk, it's very like, it doesn't mean gender, express yourself, like everything we've been talking about. Have you seen any, like, just from another spiritual business owner, have you seen any like toxic ways of using those terms? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's very common that I see spiritual practitioners tell people, especially young women who are looking for love. This is a very specific reading I feel like I see often, more often than I would like to see, I guess. Is that I see a lot of spiritualists telling young women, you need to be able to drop into a passive energy so that you can attract a masculine opposite that's going to work well with you. And I think that's very frustrating. I actually spoke to a client about a month ago, and she had seen a different spiritualist before she had met me. And that's pretty much what she was told. This client, she's a very intelligent, very like headstrong person, doing very, very well in the world of business. And she is often almost like trimmed down by the people around her, but also by the spiritual practitioners she's seen, in terms of like, oh, you're too picky, or you're too masculine. Like an equal, capable masculine partner that you're looking for is never going to be attracted to somebody like you because you're too active. And that's something that I think is really, really harmful verbiage, to use femininity as almost a synonym to being passive
Yeah.
and and not eliciting a world of your own. I think
Yeah.
that's super, super harmful, because the truth is, like, she did have a very beautiful feminine energy. She was just somebody who created all over the place. Like, I mean, this is a woman who was standing up and pitching new ideas in front of her colleagues on a weekly basis. Like, she was very actively in her feminine energy, I would argue, but she was creating. And a lot of times I think, yeah, women in particular, get looked at and they're like, no, 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 you need to be passive so that a man can step up and be active. And that is kind of what I was referencing when I was like, sometimes I think femininity and masculinity in New Age spirituality can be used as a hangover from the traditionalism of the past, because we can't deny that we are influenced by our culture, and that we're influenced by the history of our culture, be that religions, the actual organization. We're obviously living in a patriarchy. All of our rulers are men. And so there are these ideals that are kind of hand-me-downs from the generations before us. And I think it's our job as spiritualists, and especially when you're mentoring somebody, or you're trying to guide somebody through a reading, it's so important to be deliberate and careful with your words, so as to not push that person into an old ideal that could potentially be harmful to them. That being said, there's nothing wrong if you want to live a very traditional life and you want to, be very passive in your passive feminine energy. That's great. But preaching that narrative as though it's a new divine concept and you're a woman, so it's divine that you stay home, and it's divine that you just nurture and you just listen to other people's feelings and you just take care of the shit. Like, again, it can be if it's by choice, right? And not just a role that you're edged into. Um, and so, yeah, I would say that I see it a good amount.
Yeah, I think for listeners, if you come across a reader or a mentor, a spiritualist you're paying for them to guide you or whatever, and they're using the language of like, you basically don't have your own autonomy. They're telling you what to do. They're telling you what box to fit in. I think that's a huge red flag. And you're so right. Now that I think about it, now that you say that, I've seen so many, TikTok readers that do readings and they're like, you know, make yourself smaller so that something is able to come in. And it's just like you have to use a little bit more broader terms and broader wording, or maybe broader is not the right term, but just open their own autonomy and authority and inner, like will, like let them have some will in their own life. I think you're so right. I totally agree.
And I agree with that too, because I always tell people when they're like, oh, what should I do? I'm like, I'm never going to tell you what you should do. This is
Right.
100% up to you. You've got your free will, you've got your autonomy. We can talk through what a certain decision might look like for you,
Right.
and if that would be satiating to you. But when it comes to decisions in our own life, right and wrong, as long as we're being decent to other people, is pretty subjective. Should I take this job versus should I take that job? Should I opt into this relationship versus opt into that one? It is so much about what you're seeking at the end of that path, and less about this is correct, this is incorrect. And I think that's another example of we do get really locked into the binary, not only masculine and feminine, but right and wrong in terms of our personal lives. And sometimes, and I love this phrase, choices are portals. They're basically these openings that can take us into somewhere else. It's about where it is that you want to go, not necessarily is this going to be the haven of my life. Every decision you make is going to have benefits, and it's going to have consequences all in the same breath. So yeah, I agree with that. I think it is a big, big red flag if you're being read by somebody and they're like, you have to do this. And if you don't, then your life is going to be irreconcilable. I think fear mongering is dangerous in the spiritual community, in religious communities, in politics, in, any branch where anybody has influence, really.
Absolutely. Um, what is your advice of people who are, in a hyperactive masculine state, hyper masculine state, or hyper feminine, or whatever? What is your advice on kind of finding that flow, finding that balance between the two? What can people do? What is your thoughts on that?
I think it's a lot about daring yourself to question what would happen if that wasn't so deeply a part of your identity.
Hmm.
You know, the things that we do and the stages of life that we embody are not necessarily indicative of our humanity or of our souls. And that's really hard for us to grasp. So when we were talking before about, is your identity in your job, let's say for active masculine, or, for passive feminine, is your identity in the fact that you are a sounding board for other people and you feel like you can make people feel safe. There's a moment where you have to be very honest with yourself and be like, okay, is this good for my life, or is this just something that makes me feel safe? And those are different things. It's important to feel safe, but we do have to dare ourselves, first of all, to be transparent and honest with what's going on. Because I always say this, healing is such a perpetual thing, and we're never really done. There's not a timer that goes off and we're like, ding, okay, now I'm the perfect balance of feminine and masculine, and whatever. It's an ongoing journey. And so I think being really transparent with yourself and being honest about the fact that I don't know, I've never met a person who is the perfect balance of everything. It's just we're spiritual beings, but we're human beings. And so being real with, is this potentially a behavior that feels safe but is harmful to me? Even in small ways, like overworking yourself and now you don't have the ability to socialize at the end of the day, or have a good conversation with your partner because you're exhausted and that's all you put your energy into. Daring yourself to step outside of that, I think, is the scariest thing you can possibly do. And I always tell people, I'm like, microdose it. So for example, let's say you're really, really, really in your passive feminine energy. You listen to other people, you understand other people a lot, but you're really afraid to ask for what it is you want. Microdose it. So the next time a friend comes over and they're like, hey, I'm on my way over, I'm going to stop by the grocery store. Do you need anything? And maybe you don't have milk in the fridge, but you're like, it's not a big deal. It's not the responsibility. Where you normally be like, oh, no, I'm good. Text your friend back and be like, yeah, actually, could you pick up half a gallon of milk for me? And it's small, but it's a big deal. It's a really big deal if you're
Fucking
not
love
comfortable.
that.
Yeah. Or if you're in your active masculine and your boss is like, hey, I really need you to get on and send this email right away. But it's 8:30 p.m. being like, hey, actually, I'm with my family. I can't right now. That's revolutionary for a lot of us who are really far in it. It doesn't have to look so extreme as quit your job and travel the world. And, and I mean, if you do, that's awesome. But if we can, I always say it's like physical therapy a bit. when they're trying to help you work with a muscle that isn't firing in your body, they'll show you very small repetitive movements you can do to wake that muscle up until you gain more control of it. And I think the same is true on a spiritual plane. To help your spiritual body, you have to slowly exercise that muscle until you're comfortable. So by no means is that an end all be all solution, but I think it's a really good first step. And it's less revolutionary on its face, but I think it does eventually lead to that internal revolution when we get through those next steps.
Absolutely. I think if you are finding yourself not feeling good, whether that's overworked or people pleasing or whatever that is, that ultimately is a unhealthy sacrifice that you're doing, getting out of your comfort zone and just asking yourself questions, like you said, like, what would happen if I actually stopped acting this way and actually listened to myself and listened to my body? So that was an amazing piece of advice. I've never heard of it that way. Microdosing, that's so cool. I love that.
Little
That's
devils of attempt over time.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Is there anything else you want to add just as we're wrapping up? Anything else on your mind about this subject?
Oh man, I'm just so grateful that you had me. I so deeply admire your work, Mackenzie. Like, I adore everything you do. I'm your biggest fan. You have no idea. And so I'm just so glad that you opened up this conversation, and that you approach things in the way that you do, because I think that you help a lot of people, maybe that you don't even see. You know, sometimes I think we think our impact is directly with our clients, but I bet there are a ton of people who just listen to you passively and, like me, you know, adore you opening these conversations. So I feel like this has been so wonderful and so comprehensive. And I'm so, so excited. You have no idea, when I got that DM that you invited me, I was like, yes, like I've been hoping you would invite me. So thank you.
Really?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. The day you launched that, I was like, oh man, I hope someday.
Oh my God, you're so sweet. Thank you so much for saying that. And thank you for taking the time to come on, even with all the shit going on in our world, And thank you everyone for listening. And please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something new, if you've been listening passively and not speaking up. I would love to hear from you. And Haley, why don't you share anything else and just where people can find you and work with you and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. All of my social media handles are under Alrighty Aphrodite, a little tribute to her. Yeah, and like I said, I've got my book coming out later this year. So if that's something anybody is interested in, it's not a spiritual book. It's a bit of like a queer journey through poetry. Just kind of trying to balance all of my different components and putting that out. But yeah, I'm pretty active online in that way, so you can usually find me there. My website is alrightyAphrodite16.com.
Yay. And I'll put everything in the show notes, of course. Thank you so much, Haley.
Oh my God, it is absolutely my pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to rate and review Divine Gossip on whatever platform you listened in on. Head to themackenziecollective.com to work with me further. If you have any questions or have any topics you want me to cover or any guests you want me to have on, please email all of that to info@themackenziecollective.com or go to the episode description to fill out my Google form. I love you. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode.